It's a Victory Tuesday here on Locked On Grizzlies, but it's not that sweet of a win. Ja Morant goes out not once but twice due to what appears to be a minor ankle injury. I'll talk about my feelings on that. Plus, Brandon Clarke bouncing back big time and other preseason takeaways from a Memphis victory there in Dallas against the Mavericks. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, flying solo on this episode. DeMichael Cole was in the works, was in the plans to be joining me on this edition of the podcast. But of course, Ja Morant had to get injured not once, but twice. Forgive me, I'm going to calm down a little bit. I'm going to save my frustration for later in the show. Not the best circumstances to be joining you on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Not necessarily because of the Morant injury itself. Sounds like that's relatively minor, and I'll drive that point home here in a moment. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Check us out on Amazon, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, literally anywhere you get a podcast, you can get Locked On Grizzlies. Become an everydayer. Check us out each and every time that an episode drops as the season gets underway. And it was the preseason that got underway for the Memphis Grizzlies on Monday evening, hanging out there in Dallas, Texas, taking on the Mavericks, a pretty important rivalry. Obviously, if the Grizzlies want to get to where they are hoping to go in the Western Conference, all roads likely lead through Dallas at some point, whether it's the division itself, where Memphis will see the Mavs 4 times in divisional play, or whether it is the reality that is the Grizzlies hoping to get to the Western Conference Finals. Statistically speaking, there's a decent shot that it's the Dallas Mavericks and Luka Doncic that the Grizzlies are going to have to go through. There was no Luka Doncic in this contest for the Mavericks. Not something to write home about. Luka should be just fine. Was also no Kyrie Irving in this contest for the Dallas Mavericks, so Dallas was nowhere near full strength. It's a preseason game. That doesn't matter. And there's lots of things that we can talk about, lots of things that we will talk about coming out of this game, going into the next preseason game. How the offense looked, how Zach Edey looked, all sorts of different pieces of this. And some of it maybe we'll talk about later on in the show. I, for one, am thrilled that Brandon Clarke is back and performing at the level that he is accustomed to performing at and that I am accustomed to seeing him perform at. If you know, dear listener, dear viewer, as an everydayer and you've been with Locked On Grizzlies for a bit, if you haven't, welcome. Glad you're here. I'll give you a refresher. I was worried about Brandon Clarke. And I'll talk more about him later on in the show. Good to not have to worry so much anymore. My frustration to start off today's episode is with Ja Morant and those within the Memphis Grizzlies medical staff that treat him differently than literally everybody else. And I understand that the NBA is the world of superstars. No other sport, except maybe baseball, no other sport has the superstars get to do whatever they want vibe more than the NBA. And it manifests itself in different ways, right? There's a young man playing for the Los Angeles Lakers who was drafted with the 55th pick in the second round of this draft this past year, almost exclusively because his last name is James and he shares a name with LeBron James, potentially the greatest basketball player to ever live. That, again, manifests all over the place. This isn't an argument for or against family helping family. This is an acknowledgement that superstars get treatment in a variety of ways. For the Grizzlies, that is true as well when it comes to someone like Ja Morant. And it really is public knowledge, at least to me. It's clear as day that Ja Morant gets treated differently when it comes to injuries than every other member of that franchise. Jaren Jackson Jr. tweaks a hamstring. Pretty much write him off until the opening game of the season in a few weeks, right? Desmond Bane gets banged up. Marcus Smart gets banged up last year. Caution is the name of the game. Ja Morant is playing well. I want to stress that. This is not Ja Morant doing poorly. His end of the game stat line in about 18 minutes of play, 4 for 9 from the field, 5 for 5 from the free throw line. So we got to the charity stripe nicely. 4 rebounds, 3 assists, 1 steal, 1 block, 13 points. He was a plus 12 for the contest. The only guy that was better than him was Marcus Smart. We'll talk more about Smart here momentarily. So Morant was playing well. It's not a knock on Morant's ability to play basketball by any stretch of the imagination. He's pursuing in transition on defense, and the Mavericks throw the ball off his foot, which eventually leads to him rolling his ankle. For anybody that has played basketball, or even if you haven't played, if you've watched a lot of basketball, rolled ankles happen semi-regularly. And this rolled ankle, I've both watched and played a lot of basketball, didn't look anything different from what you might experience in a pickup game or in a rec league game, whatever the case might be. However, Ja Morant's ankles are those of somebody that makes 9 figures over the life of a contract. And I assumed that in a meaningless, and I do want to stress meaningless, preseason game, that would have been the end of Ja's evening. But it was not. Ja Morant comes back, not only just to the bench, dear listener, dear viewer, he comes back into the game, and he looks okay, making good defensive plays, making nice cuts to the basket. He dunks, and then as he lands off of the dunk, he feels a tweak in that ankle again, and he has to come out this time for good. Now, before I get too angry, I do want to stress that to Michael Cole, my co-host here at Locked On Grizzlies, covering this injury angle, and that's the main reason he's not able to be on this episode of the show. He posts a couple of posts, I should say, on X. First from Tim McMahon of ESPN. Taylor Jenkins says that Ja Morant left the Grizzlies win due to a minor little tweak in his ankle. He'll be evaluated, but early indications are not a significant concern. Mike Wallace at my mic check of Grind City Media. Jenkins said Ja was taken out as precaution after rolling his ankle in transition. Plan is to get Ja reevaluated back in Memphis in the next couple of days. So they're very clearly not stressing about this Morant injury. Likely he goes the way of Jaren Jackson Jr. We'll see him on opening night. But the point that I'm going to make is that it never should have gotten to this point. It never should have gotten there. Ja Morant never should have returned to the game because goodness gracious forbid if something worse did indeed happen to Morant. I mentioned the 9-figure investment. This is an extremely important season. It's an important season for Taylor Jenkins to get back to his winning stride and to show that he can coach this team to being a dominant, successful regular season club that has the possibility of moving into the postseason and having a run. I don't think he needs the run in this postseason, but I do think that he needs to show some success in that area, maybe win a series. Are you going to be able to do that? If Ja Morant is not healthy, the answer is no. He, by definition, then might be the NBA's most valuable player because if the Memphis Grizzlies lose Ja Morant, we've seen that show before when Tyus Jones isn't around. We saw it this past year. We know what the Grizzlies are without Ja in this current iteration. It's not a good look. So sometimes you have to save players from themselves. Sometimes you have to be the adult in the room and say, no, Ja, you are not going back in a meaningless preseason game, one in which Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving and Jaren Jackson Jr. are not suited up. It is not worth it. Not here, not now, not ever. Superstars get all sorts of treatment all around the NBA. I'm not going to pretend like Ja is unique in that way. But I do think that this needs to be the end of this specific type of superstar treatment. They are overly cautious with every other member of that roster when it comes to injuries, except for the one that matters the most. I don't understand. If somebody on X at Joe Mullinax, if somebody in the comments wants to explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old, I will happily listen I will read, I'll interact. I look forward to the conversation. I'll ask DeMichael on tomorrow's episode how he feels about this. Am I overreacting? I'm sure some will think that I am. But this guy is the key. We talk about X factors. Ja Morant is the factor in this team being a championship contender. Why is he being put back on the floor after the initial ankle roll in a meaningless preseason game? You can't make it make sense because it doesn't make sense. Ja, get well. Again, shout out to DeMichael doing some great reporting as we record this episode. Not considered to be too serious. No worry to kind of freak out. No reason to freak out. But I'm freaking out at the fact that it happened in the first place, the second time in particular, because that's just nonsense to me. Let me know if you agree or disagree on X or in the comments. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL fans, the season is upon us, and you can continue to start the season with a big return over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Maybe you get a hunch in the middle of the game. Maybe it involves the mighty 4-1 Washington Commanders going into a big weekend showdown this Sunday afternoon against Lamar Jackson and the Baltimore Ravens. Maybe in the middle of that game, you think that Daniels is going to throw a deep bomb to Terry McLaurin, Scary Terry, in this October, this month of Halloween, and you think a touchdown is going to ensue. You can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page where you place your bets. You will get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Again, you heard me right, $200 in bonus bets when you place your first $5 bet, and that is guaranteed. And that goes down over at FanDuel.com. I was angry about Ja, and I stand by my anger. I want to stress that. I think that's still very silly, and it's going to be very hard for anybody to convince me that I'm wrong on this particular issue. In fairness, dear listener, dear viewer, it's hard to convince me that I'm wrong on any issue. Right? I'm a very stubborn man. One thing that I am willing to admit that I was maybe overly concerned about would be the injury to Brandon Clarke and his Achilles. Because if you remember correctly, if you are not an everydayer of Locked On Grizzlies, and hopefully you are after this episode, but if you aren't, and maybe you missed this show, or to be honest, a couple of shows, Brandon Clarke blowing out his Achilles scared me good. It shook me up because Brandon Clarke is a player who very desperately needs that Achilles. I've talked about time and again his ability to leap and then leap again very quickly. That matters immensely. If he does not have that skill set, that ability to get off the basket or get off the floor, up to the basket, up to the glass as a rebounder, almost instantaneously, he loses a lot of the luster that goes along with being what Brandon Clarke was for the Grizzlies before the Achilles tear. Obviously, there was a small sample size at the end of last season where it looked like Clarke was doing well. He goes into this summer healthy, this past summer, goes into it healthy, able to work on his game. And it's only one preseason game, and you always want to see a larger sample size. But boy, oh boy, Brandon Clarke, 7 of 13 from the floor, 2 for 5 from beyond the arc. So if he has lost a little bit of that leap ability, if he can show that he can develop a stable three-point shot that teams have to respect, that'll negate that a little bit. 4 assists, another level to his game in terms of creating offense for others. He led the Grizzlies in scoring with 14 points. It wasn't a perfect performance, only 1 rebound. His net plus minus was in the negatives. Again, not a perfect in-game stat to be sure, but he was efficient with the offense. He scored the ball well. He was really good at finding open teammates and helping them facilitate their own scoring. How much of that carries over? I would argue not that much. He was 1 for 5 from the free throw line. That is more of an indicator of long-term three-point shooting than anything. I'm not sure that Clarke is able to be that guy. But if Clarke is able to be the guy that can defend against athletic bigs in particular, we saw it at the start of the second half. Zach Edey started the game for Memphis in the first half. It was Morant, Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart, Santi Aldama filling in for the injured Jaren Jackson Jr., and then you had Zach Edey. Zach Edey did not start the second half. Brandon Clarke did. How much of it was an acknowledgement of the athleticism, the ability to run that the Mavericks bigs possessed? DeMichael Cole talked about that on yesterday's show, if you remember correctly. Can Edey run with these guys? I would argue that at the end of the second quarter, it looked like he could run with them, but it was going to make him really tired. He looked pretty spent at the end of that second quarter when he came out. Understandably so. Edey is 7'4", 290 pounds. That is a very large human, much larger than just about everybody else that was on the floor that night and most nights. He is going to exert a lot more energy in this scheme, and he's going to exert a lot more energy competing against this level of talent. This ain't the Big Ten. Even in a preseason game, the NBA is home to some of the best athletes on the planet. And even in a Dallas Mavericks contest where there are three arguably best players, Luka Doncic, not an argument, Kyrie Irving, not an argument, and Klay Thompson, big time argument, didn't suit up. The Grizzlies had a chance to see what Edey could do against those bigs, Lively in particular. And he did some good things, but he also could have done some things better. Not a terrible night for Zach Edey. 7 rebounds, 6 points. He gave what Memphis needed him to give. He also had 5 fouls, something to keep an eye on as the season progresses. But if Brandon Clarke can come in and give you minutes in that spot that are efficient, both offensively and as a defensively switchable big, don't be surprised if you see Clarke getting some opportunity to be that starting 5. I don't think it's going to happen every game. I certainly don't think that it's something that the Grizzlies are planning on doing right now. But they know what they have in Brandon Clarke. They understand that he's a known commodity, especially with that leg, that injury being fully healed. I can't stress enough how much that matters, not just for Memphis, but how much that matters for Clarke himself, showing his viability as an NBA player. And truth be told, how much it matters for Edey, because Edey doesn't have to be the guy that he was at Purdue. We've talked about that a lot here on Locked On Grizzlies. He played the entire national championship game, essentially. He doesn't need to log those many minutes in an NBA game. He's going to be exerting a lot more energy because of Memphis wanting to play in transition, because of the screens that he's going to be asked to set. He's just not camping out on the block, putting his hand up anymore. There's lots more additional movement beyond what he was asked to do at Purdue. So there's layers to this. There's levels to this when it comes to Edey. And you have somebody like Brandon Clarke, as long as he's healthy, that provides a swift counterpunch to what Zach Edey is so strong at. The floater looked good. Brandon Clarke has one of the best floaters in the NBA. Clarke ran well, which is extremely important. He leapt well, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the most important part to me. Excuse me. We are talking about a guy in Brandon Clarke who helps so much with what the Memphis Grizzlies want to be, both in terms of playing alongside starters like Ja Morant and being a key reserve with the likes of guys like Scottie Pippen Jr., who we'll talk more about here later on in the show. It was a big night for Brandon Clarke, not because he dominated a preseason game, because as I've said numerous times, who cares, right? It's a preseason game. Within that preseason game scope, though, you want to be able to say that guy has the ability to impact NBA basketball games. That guy has the physical capacity to get back on defense and defend multiple positions on the floor. He can roll to the rim and either get his floater or get a dunk with one of the more efficient offensive games in the NBA at and around the basket. You could say all those things after watching Brandon Clarke. I am confident, more confident now than I was at any point last year, that Brandon Clarke can be that guy for the Memphis Grizzlies. He can be a key reserve. He can be a spot starter. He can fill in nicely alongside Jaren Jackson Jr. And as long as you have someone that can space the floor next to him, I wouldn't say Brandon Clarke and Zach Edey need to see a ton of minutes together. But again, Clarke was 2 for 5 from beyond the arc. Can he expand upon that? Can he build upon that success? It's something worth keeping an eye on, to be sure. I'm a big fan of Brandon Clarke. I'm happy to admit when I'm wrong. That's not true. I'm not really happy to admit when I'm wrong, but I will admit when I am wrong, and I think that I might have been a little bit ahead of schedule in terms of writing off Brandon Clarke. The demise of Brandon Clarke was over-exaggerated, just a smidge by me, and it's good to see him competing at this level because that Brandon Clarke is going to help the Memphis Grizzlies win some basketball games. That Brandon Clarke could be the difference between a first-round exit and a run to the Western Conference Finals. He has that much physical ability. And as long as Ja Morant's healthy, like I talked about earlier in the show, having the presence of a Brandon Clarke, a veteran guy who can provide pop off the bench scoring, be that versatile defender, matters so much for this Grizzlies team. and they are going to lean on Clarke, I'm sure, throughout the season ahead. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Gametime. I love Gametime. Helps me make memories with my family and friends at sporting events, concerts, theater shows, and so much more. Gametime has an amazing app that you can pick live events on and use all sorts of different features to help maximize your dollar, like all-in pricing. Turning that feature on shows the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. Again, you got to remember, you have to turn that feature on to use it. Plus, you have Gametime Picks, where curation makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and so much more. You get a panoramic view of your seat from the app before you buy it, and you have the lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. I love Gametime. You will too. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with the good folks over at Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKDOWNNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. We're going to close out this episode with some other takeaways, and I'm going to lead off with the two guys that I mentioned on yesterday's show that I was most interested in watching in this contest for two very different reasons. One was Yuki, my boy Yuki Kawamura. I love Yuki. I love him as a dancer. I love him as a future Memphis Hustle player down in South Haven. I think he's going to become a cult hero down there. He's not going to play many minutes for the Memphis Grizzlies. If this is a guy that's logging a lot of time in an actual NBA game that counts, like a regular season game, something has gone terribly wrong again for the Grizzlies organization. I don't think that's in the cards for Yuki. But what I do see for him is an impressive skill set that will fit well with the hustle of facilitation, creating off the dribble, having the patience even in transition opportunities to make a wonderful pass. He had 3 assists at 9 minutes of play. DeMichael Cole, stick with DeMichael of the Commercial Appeal, also of Locked On Grizzlies. He talked about Yuki having that skill set, and he certainly lived up to the hype, at least in limited minutes, in my opinion, in this contest. He closed out the fourth quarter admirably. The other name was Jalen Wells, right? And Jalen Wells didn't play a ton in this contest. He only played 11 minutes, or 12 minutes, excuse me. He got up 11 shots in 10 minutes, which is quite impressive. And it wasn't the most efficient game for him. Didn't have a steal, didn't have an assist, didn't have a block. But what he did do was make 3 of his 5 3-point attempts in the contest. There's pros and cons of that, right? If you want to be an optimist, if you want to be positive, he shot the cover after the basketball, and that's what the Memphis Grizzlies need him to do, be another floor spacer, especially in that rotation, the end of that rotation. But he shot 1 for 6 on his 2-point buckets. There's limits to his game. There's holes in it. They'll fill as the years go on. Obviously, there's development that needs to be done here. They don't need Wells right now, but they're going to want to have him at some point, and you want him to be ready. So I thought that the made 3 there to close the game, ice water in his veins, folks are going to remember that, and that's great. That's an important shot to make. It shows that he's not too small for the moment, or he won't shrink away from it. Because even in a preseason game, when it's tight like that late, if you're playing, you want to win. And Jalen Wells wanted to win, and he helped his team win. So kudos to him for that. Some other general takeaways. I mentioned Zach Edey running up and down the floor, was pretty clearly tired. I really like Santi Aldama's game in this one. Just 1 for 4 from beyond the arc, but he had 11 points, 8 rebounds, 3 assists, a pretty well-rounded 19 minutes of play for Santi Aldama. Shout out to Marcus Smart, who scored 6 points, had 5 assists, 1 steal, 1 block, played 22 minutes in the contest. Not the most efficient offensive game, did not make a single bucket outside of free throws, but he was a plus 15 for the Memphis Grizzlies. That was the top plus-minus in the contest. He's taking charges in preseason. Marcus Smart is very much my kind of basketball player. He's salt to the earth in that way. Love watching him compete. Love watching him move around, run around, be in good health, be that veteran leader that the team needs. It's really cool to see him kind of find himself in Memphis. Again, it's just one game, and it's a preseason game, but there's reason for optimism there, at least in my opinion. There's a lot of reason for optimism when it comes to Marcus Smart. He looks well. Desmond Bane, 1 for 8 from three-point land. Should we worry? Absolutely not. Come on, dear listener, dear viewer, get your head out of the clouds. Desmond Bane is going to be just fine. Not his most effective shooting night, but he got 7 rebounds, 3 assists. Again, he was a plus 11, 3 stocks, 2 blocks, and 1 steal. He found ways to contribute to winning in other spaces. Scottie Pippen Jr., that's who I'm going to close with here. DeMichael Cole's boy. Scottie Pippen Jr. logged 18 minutes in this game. He scored 12 points, 6 assists in 18 minutes played. He had 5 turnovers, which is way too high. Made some mistakes with the ball in his hand, but he was an effective offensive creator of offense for himself as well as for others. Chris Harrington of the Daily Memphian posted, when are we going to start talking about Scottie Pippen Jr. being the one who gets his contract fully realized and extended and becoming a full-blown Memphis Grizzlies roster player? I concur, Mr. Harrington. I think that we are there. And shout out to DeMichael Cole, who has loved Scottie Pippen Jr. all along. I have been meh on Scottie Pippen Jr. until the last 8 months or so. From him being called up to the Grizzlies back last season to what he did in Summer League, now with the retirement of Derrick Rose. We talked about how the easiest thing to do, the simplest thing to do, would be to just convert that contract and allow for Scottie Pippen Jr. to come up to the main roster. Nobody probably agrees with that sentiment more than Scottie Pippen Jr., who has been looking for an NBA contract for a long time. Not a two-way contract, not an Exhibit 10 contract, a full-blown NBA contract. Scottie Pippen Jr. plays like a guy that's hungry for just that. He has a tremendous ability to get to the basket, an extremely efficient finisher at the rim, at least in this contest he was. But we saw it in Summer League too. We know he can get shots for other guys. He can find people off of dribble penetration. And assuming Ja Morant's healthy, right, I want to stress there's nothing out there in the multiverse, in the Twitterverse or the Xverse that suggests that this is a long-term serious concern with Ja. They were just being safe with him. It was a precaution, again, is the report. Assuming Ja's going to play a lot of basketball, you don't need a point guard that's going to eat a lot of minutes. That's not the goal for that position. Scottie Pippen Jr. can play 12 or so minutes a game, not hurt you too much, if at all. He might be a net positive in that way, and he's a true backup. Right? He's not like Tyus Jones where he's a substitute teacher. He comes in as a starter, and that's where he racks up his efficiency and his assists and all that sort of stuff. Scottie Pippen Jr. can be that spark plug off the bench. He can be a guy that eats that time and helps Ja navigate rough waters when necessary. I'm excited about Scottie Pippen Jr. I know my partner, DeMichael Cole, the Commercial Appeal, is as well. He looked really good in this contest, give or take. Cut down on the turnovers a little bit. I think that's fair to say. Jake LaRavia looked good, 6 rebounds, 14 points, really trying to find his way into that rotation. Luke Kennard, all he does is make threes. Not true. Also had 4 assists and 3 rebounds in this game, a productive outing for him. Obviously, the Dallas Mavericks did not prioritize winning in this game. The Memphis Grizzlies maybe did a little bit more than they should have. There will be plenty to talk about with the new look offense, all that sort of stuff. I want to make sure I have DeMichael Cole with me when we get into those nuts and bolts conversations. I want to hear what he has to say. But it was a good way to get back into the grind with this Grizzlies team. I'm excited for the season. Hopefully you are as well, assuming Ja Morant is healthy and will be smart with how we use him moving forward. I hope you're listening, Grizzlies medical staff. Stop letting Ja back in the game. Save him from himself. Don't need to see him again. Make sure that ankle's ready for opening night. Thank you so much for being with us on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. I'm excited to have you guys back with us on tomorrow's episode. DeMichael Cole will be back in the fold with me. We'll be co-hosting once again. We'll talk about some offensive takeaways. Those turnovers I mentioned with Scottie Pippen Jr., he was not alone with the turnover bug. That's important to point out. The Memphis Grizzlies racked up 23 turnovers in this game. That's 23 lost possessions. I'm not going to be happy about that when I talk about it with DeMichael Cole. It is to be expected in a new look offense. We'll break all that down and then some on the next episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Make sure you're with us. Make sure you're checking out Locked On Fantasy Basketball for your next watch, your next listen. Josh Lloyd does an amazing job. Get back into your fantasy league, set up your team, and listen to Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Get ready for your draft and get ready for the upcoming season with Josh Lloyd and Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Make sure you're liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing wherever you get your podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. We here at Locked On Grizzlies hope that you'll check us out on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, literally anywhere you get a podcast. Subscribe. Help us get over 4,000 on YouTube. And by all means, make us a part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption each and every single day. I'm Joe Mullinax. Thank you for being here. Stay locked in. We'll be back on Wednesday talking new look offense and more. Until then, stay safe. Go Grizzlies. Have a good one.